As we journey through life, the path that we follow will often bring us to a crossroads. There are two paths to follow, and we need to choose one. Being flesh and blood, having the mind of the flesh, we sometimes make the wrong choice. The choices we make can sometimes drastically change our lives. One is the way of the flesh, which leads to death, and the other is the way of the Spirit, which leads to salvation. When we think of the explorers throughout history going to places where man had never been, they were the ones who cleared the path for others to follow. They used maps and compasses, made maps, and even the stars for a guide. And there is one who cleared the path for us. He gave his life willingly so others may follow. It's not an easy path, many trials and obstacles to overcome. If we stay on that path, the reward is great, greater than we could ever imagine. What we are looking at today is the true path to salvation. Salvation starts in the change from being servants to sin and entering the family of God. It's demonstrated in faith by living godly lives and is completed when at the hand of Christ, when he returns, one is granted the gift of immortality. God declared in Numbers 14 and 21, "But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." This establishes God's plans from the beginning, which leads to the purpose for salvation. It's our personal, positive involvement with God's will. Man was created as a part of God's plan to go forth and multiply, as seen in Genesis chapter 1. The earth was filled with the glory of the Lord. It's evident in all the beauty that he has made. Something happened to change plans. Sin entered the world. And as a result of this, Numbers 14 and 21 is not being fulfilled. The effects of sin has caused man to separate himself from God. In Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree, their eyes were open and they were ashamed. When they heard the voice of the Elohim, they hid themselves. That act demonstrates the separation we are discussing. They began their journey along the wrong path. Numbers 13 and 31 gives us a good example of separation. Moses had sent the men to spy out the land, and when they had returned, they brought an evil report. "We can't do it. We aren't strong enough." They lost faith. And in Numbers 14, they rebelled against God's will of them entering the land. And God threatened to destroy them. Moses interceded for the people. This leads us to Numbers 14 and 21. Israel was not glorifying God by their actions. God's will shall eventually be done, completely evidenced by Matthew 6 and 10. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven." Many people say these words, but do they truly understand the meaning? Now separated from God because of sin, man must return to him, if his will involves man in God's ultimate purpose. God establishes the path by which man can return. In 2 Corinthians 5 and 18, it says, "And all things are of God, who hath reconciled us to himself by Jesus Christ, and hath given us to the ministry of reconciliation." To reconcile is to return back to someone. The Apostle Paul shows us that God has chosen Christ as the means by which reconciliation will occur. This is as Jesus said in John 14 and 6. "I am the way, the traveled way, the path. No man cometh to the Father but by me." This gives the thought that Christ is the only way. We will look at that some more later. The apostles preached that salvation is only through Christ. And in Acts 4 and 12, they said, "Neither is there salvation in any other. For there is none other name under heaven given among men, whereby we must be saved." The message presented by the apostles focused on Christ as the way to salvation. The idea of a path is something that you will follow to lead you somewhere. It's very simple. We have demonstrated that mankind is now in a state of separation from God, and man needs to be returned to God's way for his purpose to be fulfilled. Secondly, that Christ is the means that God has established to bring man back. Then the question arises, how is Christ the path? A lot could be said on this, but today we'll focus our thoughts on 3 points. They are faith, obedience, and sacrifice. Faith. Christ's example in Hebrews 12 and 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. Christ believed all that God had promised of the Messiah, which at the time of the crucifixion had not yet been accomplished. He believed that not even death on the cross would prevent God from keeping his word. Christ's faith went beyond the cross. He knew what was to come, and that would help. How does this apply to us? We see that in Hebrews 11 we have a catalog of the faithful men and women who showed the power of their faith. In verse 7, by faith Noah did what God required, although he had never witnessed rain or the destruction that God warned of. So you can imagine here's someone who was told that it was going to rain and everything would be destroyed and it would flood, and he had never seen it. But yet he had the determination and faith to go on, preaching for all those many years, knowing that God had predicted these things, and his faith was strong. And by faith, in verse 8, Abraham left his old life and willing to accept what God had promised was more valuable than the riches he had. He was a very rich man. He had many things, and he could have stayed where he was. But because of his faith and what God asked and told him what would come, he left and went to somewhere where he had no idea of what was going to happen. And in verse 24, by faith Moses chose the promises of God over the comforts of Egypt. And here he was in a point where he was second in command over all the land. He had everything he could ever want, the riches and all those things. But because of his faith, he chose to follow the path of life. These examples are given to us as an inspiration to do likewise. The key is believing what God has spoken, even when current circumstances might seem better. Sometimes we look at our surroundings and think that things are going well. We have all we ever could want. But living by faith means that we can overcome the difficulties of life by believing that God has promised something better. If we are willing to follow Christ's example, to walk along that path that he has provided for us. The next point is obedience. And Christ's example is in John 5 and 30. I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father which has sent me. Jesus' primary goal day to day was to do the work given to him by his heavenly Father. That work was to teach the gospel of the kingdom. In Philippians 2 and 8, we read, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient, even unto death, even the death of the cross. Matthew 26:39 says, when Jesus was praying to his Father, nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. Christ's obedience was so complete that he submitted himself to a horrible death in order for God's will to be done. How does this apply to us? In 1 Corinthians 10:31, whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Whatsoever. Keeping the idea of God's glory in mind, his will being done. Then we will be obedient to him in all things, that we might glorify him in our words and deeds. Doing the will of God from the heart, in Ephesians 6:6. This means that we are desiring that God be recognized in our actions and given praise because of his influence in our lives. In Hebrews 13, making you perfect in every good work to do his will. God works in our lives, giving us direction and ability to do his work. In this way, his will is being fulfilled in our lives. Sacrifice. This is the next point. Christ's example. The ultimate that we considered in his submission to the cross. How does this apply to us? In Luke 9:23, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. To follow here means to do as he did, to emulate his example. Then what are we to crucify? Romans 6:6 has the answer. Knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, and that henceforth we should not serve sin. And what is the old man? It is our former way of life, symbolically crucified or destroyed when one is baptized. And if we look at Colossians 3, verses 5 and then 8 through 10. Verse 5, mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth. Fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. For which things' sake the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience. And looking at verses 8 through 10. But now ye also put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. Lie not one to another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. So we note that the old man is in verse 9, and the new man is verse 10. And the old man is like taking off the coat of your old ways of life and putting on the newness, the new coat. In verse 5, to mortify is to put to death. The list is the things of the flesh, which keeps us from doing God's will. The opposite of this list is seen in Galatians 5:22 and 23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. The fruit of the Spirit. This means what living spiritually, following God's will produce. Following Christ's example in these ways will mean we are following the path that God has established. This is the path that leads us back to God and will allow his glory to be reflected in all the things we do. And by making the choice to step onto this path and accept God's direction, we will be drawing closer to him and will be doing his will in our lives. We look to the time when what Christ says in the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven, will be fulfilled. When all men do God's will, then God will be glorified in the earth as he intended in the beginning. Before sin entered the world and caused an important part of creation, man to be separated from him. In his mercy, he has shown us the way back to him. We must be determined to hold on to the faith of Christ. There is no hope in any other direction. There is no promise in the direction of human wisdom and the ways of the flesh. It is up to us to accept and follow that true path to salvation.